各位乡亲、各位朋友，大家好，大家好，大家好，欢迎大家来参加今天2020年加拿大。I'd like to welcome everybody to today's event, in which we explored how the Taiwan model could be considered in rethinking Canada's China policy. My name is Tianli Xu. I'm honored to be your host with a distinguished, renowned journalist, columnist, scholar, and author to be our special guest. Mr. Jonathan Mantrop doesn't need my introduction because he's well known. And his long career in journalism, specializing in Canadian politics and international affairs. He has written numerous articles and columns, given lots of talks, and written many books. Among other things, I'm very much impressed with his knowledge on the relationship between Taiwan and China. In his book, Forbidden Nation, History of Taiwan, he successfully shows that no Chinese government, including the Qing dynasty, the former KMT government, or the current Chinese Communist government, has ever exercised government authority over both the mainland and Taiwan at the same time. This simple fact strongly discredits and disproves the favorite rhetoric Chinese government like to have, saying Taiwan has been an inalienable territory of China since the ancient time. In his another book, Path of the Panda, Jonathan uses strong evidence to show that the Chinese government has been working very hard and successfully to embed agents of influence in politics, business, media, and academia in Canada. But unfortunately, Jonathan points out that our government seems to have failed to recognize and counter this. He just had another book published in August entitled Restoring Democracy in an Age of Populists and Pestilence, which he will talk more about later. By the way, in the comments section of your YouTube, you will see links to information you need for all the books we mentioned here. At a time when almost all the countries in the world are rethinking their strategies to deal with China for its constant and relentless bullying, threats, and intimidation, Canada should be no exception. And the threats and intimidation and bullying are not only against other countries, but also against its own people. We know as Taiwanese Canadians, we have jobs to do. We have to work together with people of all other ethnic backgrounds in this country to help our government in this country we now call home to deal with seemingly difficult but very important task. We are very fortunate and grateful to have Jonathan as our special guest today. I'm sure his knowledge, his experience, his observations, and his insights will help shed light on our important task ahead of us. Let's welcome Mr. Jonathan Mantrop to the program. Before I turn over the mic to you, Jonathan, I'd like to say that the tactics used by the Chinese government are by no means their invention or their monopoly. Actually, we all know that almost all totalitarian regimes in history in the whole world use the same or similar kind of tactics. But I believe they all will come to haunt them. Just look at what happened in Taiwan. Decades ago, the KMT government used similar tactics. But these tactics eventually contributed to the forming of Taiwan. Jonathan, what do you think?
Well, let me say, first of all, thank you for the privilege and pleasure of letting me take part in this event. And I want to first compliment you, Tianli, on being able to sum up two of my most recent books in about 3 or 4 sentences. I'm not sure I could do that at all. And you got absolute central points, bang on. If I'd just written those 3 or 4 sentences, I wouldn't have had to written anything else. You got the message very quickly. But I think, there's something else I'd like to say, which I think is very important too, just at the outset. You'll hear me in my remarks refer exclusively to the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. And in all my speeches and presentations, I am very careful to do that because, as you all know, we have in Canada 1.5 million people of ethnic Chinese heritage. Many have been here for generations, were born here, born as Canadians. Others have come here and have chosen to be Canadians. Among them are a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of people who are here as agents of influence for the Chinese Communist Party, but it is a minute number, and we shouldn't allow ourselves, our view of the whole Chinese Canadian population, or indeed the Asian Canadian population, to be colored by those few agents of influence for the Chinese Communist Party. So I will reinforce the message, I hope, in what I say, that the PRC is not China and the CCP is not the Chinese people. And we must always, always, always keep that very much in the front of our mind. But I think, you raise a very good point. Now, there are dramatic changes going on in Canada about its view of the PRC. And as yet, I haven't seen the sort of turn by Canadian politicians, academics, business people, and indeed, to a certain extent, the media, to realizing that as we in Canada search for allies in Asia, countries like Taiwan and other democracies in Asia make far more sense as long-term, broadly based friends of Canada than does the People's Republic of China. Now, I think in the last year or so, year and a half, 2 years, that has begun to change. It started, I think, when under Xi Jinping, the PRC began to be much more aggressive and assertive. It ended the period of Deng Xiaoping's hide your ambitions. Xi Jinping has not hid his ambitions for the PRC or the CCP at all. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, the construction of militarized bases in the South China Sea, his, one could only say, is sort of fascist actions in Xinjiang against the Uyghur people. And I think all of these have entered the consciousness of Canadian people. Now, what really came to a head, of course, was in December 2019 with the beginning of the Huawei affair, when the Canadian authorities detained on a perfectly legitimate extradition warrant issued by the US Department of Justice. They detained Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei. Now, the PRC's response, the Chinese Communist response, was not to make any diplomatic forays. They instantly kidnapped 2 Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. And this has had a profound effect on Canadian people. I think that it has made them realize in a very harsh and brutal and unfortunate way that all this nonsense that we've been fed for the last 30, 40, 50 years about the Chinese Communist Party being willing to reform if we just show them the way, and that Canadian values will be the model for the CCP, it has been all utter nonsense. This is a regime, when it is confronted with a situation it doesn't like, its first instinct is to take hostages. And the 2 Michaels now have been detained. They have also been tortured. They've been held under deplorable circumstances for a year and a half while Meng Wanzhou's case goes through the courts. And this has really affected Canadian public opinion. Now, recent polls show that about 80% of Canadians either no longer regard the PRC as a friendly country, or else they feel that it is actively a challenge to Canada. So there's some evidence. Some of those feelings have got to politicians as we speak. There is, I think it's suspended at the moment, but there is a parliamentary committee inquiring into the state of Canada-PRC relations, and hopefully it will complete its work, and hopefully it will come up with some sensible suggestions for restructuring that. One sees less change of attitude amongst officials, I must say. Although what is very interesting, I think, is that we now have on public record and very active in the media several retired Canadian ambassadors and senior diplomats who are saying what they really think about the PRC in the media and on public forums. And that hasn't happened before. That's a change. And I mean, I would like to think that perhaps my book, Claws of the Panda, sort of opened that door and enabled people to start talking about some of these things which they've been reluctant to do because of fears of being accused of racism, which is always the first weapon the Chinese Communist Party turns to when it is confronted by opposition from outsiders. So I think we've got a healthy debate going on here, and I think by and large people realize that Taiwan is the sort of Asian ally that Canada should be working with and should be building a relationship with, and not the PRC, because we can have a broad relationship with Taiwan in a way that we cannot with the PRC.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Let's turn to Taiwan. In Canada, there seems to be a systematic bias in all three levels of government against Taiwan. Despite the wills of the elected officials, the bureaucrats have simply routinely advised the politicians, regardless of political parties, not to get too close with Taiwan in order to avoid conflicts with China. Do you see this trend changing in the current climate? And what are the best ways to deal with this bias?
Yeah. Well, as I've said, I think it is beginning to change. I think that all the events, and particularly the activities of the CCP and the PRC in the last year and a half, 2 years, or probably really one could say since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, I think that has changed attitudes here a great deal. There are many things that we can do to strengthen the Canada-Taiwan relationship. I think we need to look at the trade relationship. It's a fairly strong one. I've got some figures here in front of me. At the current, we export about $2 billion worth of goods to Taiwan, and we import nearly $6 billion worth of goods. We export mostly mineral products and natural resources, and we import machinery and other goods of that sort, technical goods. I think we can do much better than that. We are both innovative societies as well. Taiwan is a highly innovative society. I mean, its technological sector in many areas is second to none around the world. But Canada also has very strong innovative and technological strengths, and I think that we should be looking, and maybe it was something that the Taiwanese Canadian community here could be assisting with and looking at closely, is those areas where there is a community of interest. One of the ones that immediately occurs to me, and I'm not an expert in these trade or technology fields at all, and would never pretend to be, but it seems to me that one of the areas springing out of the current pandemic is medical technology, and also of systems such as care for the elderly. The pandemic here has revealed that we have a really serious problem in Canada about how to care for our elderly. 82% of the deaths in the pandemic here have been in elderly care homes. And we need to work on this, and we need to join with other people, other countries, such as Taiwan, who have profound experience of these sort of questions and these sort of issues. As we know from Taiwan's experience, very excellent experience in confronting the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, it does help to have a vice president who's an epidemiologist. I understand that. But even so, Taiwan has done an extraordinary job, especially considering the normal traffic backwards and forwards to the People's Republic of China under normal conditions. Taiwan's done an extraordinary job of containing the epidemic, and COVID-19 is not going to be the last pandemic we face in this age of globalization. So I think we in Canada, we have some extraordinary epidemiologists, as we know as well. But there is always information to be shared and experiences to be shared on these things. And so I think the whole medical area is one where Canada and Taiwan could perhaps develop a much closer relationship than they have. And that, of course, has particular resonance because of the PRC's successful efforts at this point to keep Taiwan out of the WTO. And I think it would be it would send a very strong political message to Beijing if Canada was to very openly and purposefully develop a medical relationship with Taiwan. And I would urge Canadians of Taiwanese heritage to put their shoulders behind seeing what can be done in that area. The other area, and perhaps I think this should be the main focus of improving Canada-Taiwan relations, is for Canada to back Taiwan's joining what is now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is now, I think, 11 countries of the Asia-Pacific Rim. It doesn't include People's Republic of China, and it doesn't include the US, but it includes very many of the Pacific Rim democracies. And it seems to me only logical that it should include Taiwan. And I would strongly urge Canadian Taiwanese to do all they can to urge their MPs and other business people and other influence to encourage Ottawa to seek Taiwan's membership of the CPTPP. I know that there's a lot of support for that, even amongst officials and amongst diplomats and amongst business people. It makes absolute sense that Taiwan should be in that group. And I think that's something that Canadians of Taiwanese heritage can push for and support and gain a lot of support from the broader community.